The events of the story began in the city of Suffolk near the seashore. There was a beautiful red house consisting of more than 2 floors. This house was built approximately in 1770. The house was distinctive in terms of design and location. It had a small back garden that was not well arranged, but the front garden was beautiful. It has tall, fruitful trees, and near the house you can see the sea clearly. The house was intended to receive travelers. The owners of the house have furnished the rooms so that those wishing to stay in the house can reserve a room and stay in it for as long as they wish. They also provide food service. One day in the spring, the weather was beautiful, and the whole city seemed like a piece of paradise when Thompson, a university student studying at Cambridge University, arrived. Thompson was from a wealthy family, but he did not prefer to stay with them during the holidays as he had many siblings and those who constantly bother him. Thompson also wanted to be alone with himself throughout his vacation, and he chose the city of Suffolk specifically because he knew that it was a beautiful city with a long history, and he had passed there before with a group of friends and liked it very much. But that time he decided to go alone to spend a while. It was spring break. Thompson's vacation was a full month, and he decided to spend it in that city and in the Red House in particular. Thompson arrived and made his reservation. He was afraid that he would not find vacant rooms in the Red House, but fortunately for him, the house was completely empty of guests. Therefore, as soon as he arrived at the house, he was welcomed by Mr. and Mrs. Bates, who were the owners and also run the house. It was a warm welcome that made Thompson feel great relief. Mr. and Mrs. Bates decided to give Tom the best room in the house. In fact, Mr. Bates carried Tom's bags to a large room on the first floor. The room contained a bed, a closet, and a small desk with a comfortable chair placed next to the window. The window was looking to garden directly, and the sea can be clearly seen from it. The room was beautiful and comfortable. Tom quickly felt settled and comfortable in it. Tom's vacation began well. He would wake up in the morning to have breakfast with Mr. and Mrs. Bates, and then wander around the countryside, and he would return again to have lunch at the Red House. When evening came, he would return again to the city and go to the bar where the locals spent the night to have some drinks and chat, and then he would return again to the Red House to sleep. Tom was very happy and wanted to. He stays as long as possible and had no problem spending the entire holiday month at home with Mr. and Mrs. Bates. One afternoon, when Tom was walking around looking at the countryside, he decided to change his usual way. He had a desire to explore more of that beautiful city, and then he saw a large white object. Tom did not understand what this object was, so he approached it closer to find out what it was. Then he discovered that it was a large, square-shaped stone with a hole in the middle, also in the shape of a square. Tom began examining the stone and going around it, but he did not find anything special about it, so he asked himself why they placed this stone in that particular area. Tom moved from the stone and looked at the sea and the churches and houses that were located in that area. They were simple and at the same time beautiful. Tom returned from his tour to the Red House to have lunch. Although the food was delicious, something occupied Tom's mind and did not let him enjoy what he was eating. In the evening, when he went to the bar where he had been drinking with the locals since he arrived, he found Mr. Bates. Then Tom approached him to ask him about the large white stone he had found and the secret of its presence in that area. Mr. Bates told him that this stone had been in that area for a long time, even before he and his wife came to reside in the city. One of the men in the bar said that he learned from his father that people say that this stone brings bad luck and that anyone who stands on it to fish will not be able to catch even a single fish. Tom was curious and immediately asked why, but as soon as he asked that question, he prevailed. The entire bar was silent, and the men looked at each other. Tom realized that there was something about this stone that they didn't want to talk about. Tom felt confused, but he ignored the matter. He decided to continue his vacation without disturbing himself or others. Several days passed for Tom in the city, but one day he felt that he did not want to go out and would spend his time today reading. He had breakfast with Mr. and Mrs. Bates, who told him that they were going to the market to buy some supplies and asked him if he needed anything. Tom thanked them and went to his room. He stayed in the room for a long time, until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Mr. and Mrs. Bates had not returned yet, and Tom felt tired from reading. So he decided to stop and rest for a while, and then he made a reckless decision, which was to leave his room to watch. The rest of the rooms are on the same floor where he lives. Tom came out of his room and silence prevailed in the house. There were no sounds except the sounds of flies and the sounds of tree leaves colliding with each other due to the wind. The sun was shining and the weather was very hot. There are 4 rooms on the floor other than Tom's room. Tom opened the first 3 rooms on the floor where he lived. They were not locked with a key. The rooms were similar to his room. In fact, they were almost identical to his room, except for minor details related to the color of the bed covers and other minor details, which are not mentioned, but they were all beautiful and clean. Tom headed to the 4th room, which is located at the end of the floor in which he resides. He tried to open the door, but the door was locked with the key, which greatly aroused Tom's curiosity. The room was to the west, south of the house. Tom does not know why he felt an urgent desire to open that particular room. Tom went downstairs, specifically to the reception desk, because he knew that there was a keychain containing all the room keys. He knew this from the first day he stayed there. In the red house, when Mr. Bates took out the key to the room where Tom was staying and gave it to him, Tom found the keychain as he remembered it, so he carried it and quickly went up to the last room and began trying one key after another until he was able to open the room with one of the keys. He opened the door he entered and started looking around. The room was different from the rest of the rooms in that it had 2 windows. The first looked to the south and the second to the west. That is why it was very bright and at the same time very hot. Tom looked at the floor and did not find any carpets, and on the walls there were no paintings. There was no furniture, except for one bed in the corner of the room. The room was normal and uninteresting. Tom stood looking at it for a while, but suddenly he felt that something abnormal was happening. He turned and left the room immediately and closed the door, which made a big noise behind him. Tom stood in front of the room's door from the outside, trying to comprehend what he had just seen in the room. Tom said to himself, there was someone there. In the bed, Tom felt like screaming. He couldn't see anyone. He tried to remember the bed. The bed was empty, or maybe there was someone on it. Someone completely covered with covers. Tom thought that maybe there was someone dead, but he retracted his idea because he remembered well that he saw this person moving. Tom was in the middle of the day and the sun was shining, and he was aware of everything that was happening around him, so he could not possibly be asleep. He thought quickly about what he should do, and then he looked at the keychain in his hand and repeated, "First, of course, I must close the door as it was." And when he approached again to put the key in the door, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door, coming from inside the room, but he decided to continue closing the door. So he put the key and turned it as quietly as he could, but nevertheless, he continued to hear the sound. The sound of the footsteps was getting louder, and it seemed that it was getting closer to the door. Tom felt terrified. He ran to his room and closed the door on him as quickly as he could. Tom was expecting to find this person entering his room and thought that perhaps he could pass through the doors and walls. Tom sat on his bed waiting for what might happen, but fortunately, nothing happened. After some time, Tom calmed down a little and started asking himself, "Now what? What am I going to do?" The first thought that came to his mind was to leave the house as soon as possible, but if he told Mr. and Mrs. Bates about his decision and about his change in plans, they would be sure that something was wrong, and he began to think about what he would tell them if they insisted on knowing the reason for leaving. How would he explain that he went to open the rooms and headed to the front desk, picked up the keychain, and opened one of the locked rooms in the house? What if Mr. and Mrs. Bates already knew about the existence of this person? How could they live in the house if they knew about his existence? Tom tried to reassure himself that there was nothing to be afraid of, and that perhaps it is best for him to stay at home and not say anything about what happened to anyone. This was easy for Tom, who stayed for another week, and during that week, his mind did not stop thinking about the person in that room, who he was, and why he did not tell anyone, and why did he not appear at meal times as he did. Tom tried a lot to ignore the matter and did not try to approach the room again, but despite that, he made sure to stop in the corridor leading to the rooms and try to listen. Perhaps he could hear this person's voice or his footsteps, but every time Tom would only find the sound of silence. Tom did not even try to ask anyone in the city about the locked room because he felt so afraid. But in the end of the week, he could not think of anything else except the person in the locked room. He wanted to know who he was and why he was staying in that room, and why he never saw him during his entire stay from the time he arrived in the city. So Tom began to devise a solid plan to find the answer to all those questions running through his head, and at the same time ensure that he would not be embarrassed by Mr. and Mrs. Bates. Also, he should provide himself with a way to escape if things happened to escalate in any way. The next day, Tom went to the train station and asked about the nearest train that could take him back to Cambridge, where he resides. Tom learned that the first train to leave the station for Cambridge would be at exactly 4 in the evening the next day, so Tom booked a return ticket and kept it in his pocket. Then he returned again to the Red House and began to collect his bags in order to leave exactly as he had planned. The next day, he told Mr. and Mrs. Bates that he had decided to cut short his vacation and return to the university because he remembered that he had to buy some books and basic needs that he had to buy. Before the start of the new semester, Mr. and Mrs. Bates felt sad because Tom was such an entertaining companion to them, and because he was the only guest in the house. Tom paid the rent for his accommodation and told them that he had been very happy staying with them in the past days and that he would never forget that vacation. And indeed, Tom began to. He unloaded his bag, and Mr. Bates helped him place the bags on the horse-drawn cart he had specially ordered to carry all of Tom's belongings to the train station. After Tom and Mr. Bates finished putting all the bags in the cart, Tom asked him to go back up to his room to take a last look before leaving to make sure he had not forgotten any of his things in the room. Mr. and Mrs. Bates immediately agreed. Tom thanked them politely and quickly went up to the first floor, and then he took the keychain from his pocket. He knows very well that he did not forget anything in his room and did not go up in the first place in order to enter his room. Rather, he went up to enter the last room, which he knows that there was someone in it, and he wants to know more about him. Tom stood quietly in front of the door of the room, feeling nervous and hesitant before he put the key in the door, but he stopped and laughed at his tension, saying to himself, "He is most likely not a real person at all. How ridiculous I am." Indeed, Tom opened the door to the room and found it as it was. He looked at the bed and found a pile of old clothes on it, and here he was certain that he was foolish. He laughed again at his extreme fear before. He turned to leave the room, but then he heard steps approaching him from behind from inside the room, and then Tom quickly turned around, as if he wanted to confirm to himself that it was just his imagination and that there was nothing, but he actually saw the pile of clothes moving towards him as if it had been embodied in the form of a man wearing a jacket with a shirt underneath it, a knife stuck in the bottom of the shirt, and blood appearing to be dried around it. Tom opened the door to get out quickly, and he actually headed to the stairs while running and was unable to balance out of fear, so he fell from the top of the stairs, and everything turned black at this time. After a short while, Tom opened his eyes to find Mr. Bates standing next to him with some water, trying to get Tom to drink it. Mrs. Bates was holding a bag of ice and placing it on Tom's head, and they both seemed very upset. As soon as Mr. Bates noticed Tom opening, he looked at him with reproach and said to him, "You should not have done that, Mr. Thompson. Sir, what you did was very stupid. My wife and I were good to you. How could you do this to us?" Tom looked at him, not knowing what he had done. Mr. Bates continued his speech. "Why did you want to look in that room? What you did will make us lose our job completely. If you tell anyone what you saw in that room, no one will want to stay in our house again." Tom was unable to defend himself, but he looked remorsefully at Mr. Bates and said to him, "I just wanted to know who this was. That's all." Mr. Bates sat in front of him and put his hand on his face. Tom continued his speech. "Tell me what this is, and I will not tell anyone. I promise you this." Mrs. Bates moved from Tom and sat next to her husband. She looked at her husband with a reassuring look and then began to tell Tom what she knew. "Well, when we came to buy this house from the previous owner, he was also working in hospitality and would open the house to receive guests to stay. And then he told us the story of one of the men who came to stay in the house. He was a very wealthy man, and this was a long time ago, and he was spending his day while wandering around the countryside. One day, some men came out and attacked him. They knew he was rich, so they wanted to steal his money. The man tried to resist and defend himself, but their number was too large, so they caught him and tied him to the white stone, the old one on the far road. They stuck the knife in his stomach, and he died instantly. They stole all the things that were with him at that time, and then carried the stone on which they tied the man and threw it into the water. But since that time, the city's residents noticed that fish never come to the area, and they began searching for the reasons, especially since that area is rich in fish, and people have been accustomed to fishing there since ancient times. And then they began to descend in groups to see what was obscuring the fish, but they found nothing but this stone. When they took the stone out, they found the remains of a skeleton tied to the stone, and then the whole city knew what had happened with the man and why he had disappeared without any prior warning. The people of the city buried the man in the nearby graves and extracted the stone, and then the fish began to return again to that area. And when we bought the house, the price was suitable for us, and the old owner told us that he had seen and heard strange things happening in that room more than once. Even the few times he tried to let guests stay in this room, they would describe strange and terrifying things happening to them. That is why the previous owner decided to close the room. Exactly when we made the purchase, he advised us to also close that room and leave the bed in it, only because the ghost of the rich man might come back again to sleep in the same room that he used to sleep in when he was alive. Since our first day here in this place, we decided to close the room and did not open it up. You're the first person to see it since we bought this house. We've never had any problems with that room. Mr. Bates interrupted her, just saying, "Please don't tell anyone." Tom felt embarrassed because Mr. Bates was pleading with him sadly, and Mrs. Bates continued, "We don't want people talking about ghosts in this house, because that will prevent people from staying with us, and we will have no source left." Tom shook his head emphatically and swore that he would not tell anyone anything he knew or heard at their house. Tom returned to his university, and when his friends tried to ask him about his vacation, he told them everything he had done, but of course he kept his promise to Mr. and Mrs. Bates and did not mention the terrifying incident that had happened. Even after Tom graduated, worked, and traveled to many places around the world, he did not tell anyone about it. Tom was a famous lawyer and had one assistant whom he trusted. This assistant often noticed Tom's strange behavior. Every time he entered one of the rooms, he made sure to open the door very loudly. Then he would stop outside for a few seconds, and when he entered the room, he would stand up. For a full minute, he inspected every corner of the room with his eyes and made some annoying noises before he began to place his things and belongings to stay in the room. The assistant asked Mr. Tom more than once about the secret of this strange routine, but Mr. Tom did not want to talk about it. 1 year ago, Mr. Tom was invited to a dinner in the city of Suffolk, which he still remembers well. When he entered the city, he was recalling all the memories he had lived there during the terrifying spring break. But when he arrived at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Bates, he did not find it. Rather, he found a large hotel on a large area of land occupied the same place. Mr. Tom went to dinner and told his friend that he had previously visited the city and asked him about Mr. and Mrs. Bates and their red house. His friend told him that after Mrs. Bates's death, Mr. Bates decided to sell the house to a company that turned the house into a large hotel. As for Mr. Bates, he traveled to his daughter to live with her in one of the neighboring cities, and he does not know whether he is still alive or whether he died due to old age. Tom was saddened by the news of Mrs. Bates's death and did not comment on the matter. On the evening of that night, when Tom entered the room in which he was going to sleep at a friend's house, he repeated his usual routine, and here his assistant asked him again about the secret of what he was doing. Tom sat smiling and told him that only today could he answer his question and tell him the secret of this routine that he had not stopped doing for years.